Hi there, y'all. I thought I'd take a quick pause and answer some questions from the Patreon. If you want to get your question answered, you should join us over there. Starting out with Maximus Leather asked 2 questions. I'm going to be a basic bitch and ask about what you're carrying these days. I'm thinking of changing my carry. I currently carry a basic P365. Okay, this one's simple enough. A Glock 19 with a red dot and a light. It's simple, it's reliable, and it does everything I need it to while using cheap mags and parts. Occasionally, I'll bump into a clothing choice, in particular from Dressed Femme, that I end up carrying a 380 EZ because it fits in a pocket holster as a purse gun, which leads to your next question. Thoughts about downsizing caliber, in parentheses 380, but keeping the same overall size, perhaps even a bit bigger of a gun, for better control if a crisis actually happens. I wouldn't. The P365 is fine. If you were to switch to a 380 version of the same gun, you'd be able to get slightly easier follow-up shots given its form factor. You'd also be able to do the same with a slightly larger platform, as you're saying. However, think about the amount of time and money and energy that would go into switching your platform, changing out all the individual pieces, having all of the accessories that you want for the new gun, then compare that to the ammo you could buy and train with that amount. You're likely better off just training more, especially when you start stretching that out over time. 380 has far more expensive ammunition, both defensive and training are worlds apart from 9mm Luger, and that will discourage training in the future. Not to mention, frankly, defensive 380 ammunition is either Hornady Critical Defense FTX, or it has a problem in short barrels. And even out of long barrels, the data is kind of complicated, and you need to get into the weeds to figure out what works for your use case. 380 needs to get its own episode in the near future. I totally understand where you're coming from here, but I don't think this is the best way to go. There's some argument for it if you start with it as a beginner, but contradictorily, I can't recommend it to beginners because you'd have to deep dive into the ammo data to understand what you can shoot and why, and I would never tell a beginner to do that. Okay, Dominic has asked a bunch of questions. How would you structure a range day for a first-time shooter? I run Rainbow Reload, and I'd like to think that we have range days for beginners down to a science at this point. Prep starts before you've even gone to a range. We do a safety briefing for new folks at a neutral location, have a discussion about gun safety, people's experience levels, what everyone is hoping to get from the day, and if everyone seems ready to go and kind of passes a vibe check, we go to the range as a group so everyone stays comfortable. First, 22 rifle. For someone who has zero experience with firearms, you want the very first shots to be 1, fun. You want the person to have a positive experience, and 2, successful. If you can say, hell yeah, bullseye, the first time someone shoots and get a smile, you've got a gun fan for life. Let them get comfortable with that, maybe 10 to 50 rounds depending on the shooter. Then I move on to the 380 EZ. It is capable as a fighting pistol-ish, asterisk, again, 380 needs its own episode, while being super easy to manipulate and super soft shootout. And as such, it works fantastically as a confidence booster. A full box of ammo in small bursts, helping them figure out stance, recoil control, grip, and get to the point that they are confidently hitting well enough to get near the center and consistently on a 10-inch target at 10 meters, with effort and trying. Then, give them a little bit of a rest if you can. Then let them get a few magazines through a modern pistol. Something with a red dot, a light would be best. A Glock 19, Smith & Wesson M&P, whatever somebody currently has as their sidearm. It'll let them see the difference in recoil, while also seeing how much easier it is to aim with a red dot. Then, after all of that, if they're up for it and they're not overwhelmed, we move on to an AR, especially if you have something on hand that's well-tuned and can perfectly dispel the myths about recoil. But even a bog standard PSA will be fine enough to get the idea across that ARs are far less scary than they ever needed to think of them. Importantly, remember, when somebody is first shooting, they have not built up any sort of physicality or any sort of kind of mental understanding of the physicality involved in shooting. And as such, give some allowance for that. Try and build in little bits of rest time if you can. It's a lot harder to do that with rented range time, but if you can go somewhere that gives you like a big chunk of time, having moments of pause is a great way to build in kind of making sure they don't get physically overwhelmed with the task at hand, and make sure the experience is a positive one. What would a training plan look like for someone interested in concealed carry? How would that plan change if focused on community defense? So I would make the argument that if you are currently training to get a base level CCW, that is, the things you should be focusing on aren't going to change regardless of your goal. Your goal in both cases is effectively using a firearm in an emergency. There's a lot of non-gun stuff I would make sure if you're doing that, I would make sure to be focused on. Take a Stop the Bleed class as an absolute bare minimum. I would make sure to have a thorough understanding of medical supplies, and in particular things like your different types of emergency bandages, tourniquets, which ones are good, bad, how to stage them, all of that stuff. I would make sure you have a good understanding of the law in your area. That's one that a lot of people skip over. It is important to understand, if you're talking about something like, especially for community defense, if your state has a duty to retreat, it can make community defense far more complicated. It also gets more complicated as for working with large groups and how liability transfers. That changes from state to state. It is also, law is partially a thing that is the thing that is written, and it's partially a thing that the police will actually enforce. And it is worth knowing what the police will actually enforce in addition to what the paper law is in your area, because they will be different things. Once you get all of that stuff down, there's a few drills I would focus on. Get your 10-10-10 absolutely fucking down. That's 10 rounds in 10 seconds on a 10-inch target 10 meters away. The first few weeks, it'll be figuring out how to not fail the drill, and eventually you'll nail down all of the different bits on how the gun is pushing you around, and you'll start trying to reduce your time as low as you can. Then you need to figure out a bunch of different pieces, each of which can be kind of practiced as its own drill. Drawing from concealment, shoot, don't shoot, failure correction, magazine changes, transitioning between targets, transitioning between cover, transitioning to kneeling positions, rapid follow-ups, the effective fire drill. There's a lot of different individual components that you should be focusing on to get your shooting better. But it's also really important to be focusing on all of the stuff around it as much. I feel like there is very clear guides on how to get yourself to being a competent shooter. And I feel like a lot of people skip past the reality of actual thinking through what happens if you need to use your gun defensively. And it's really important to be doing that if you're going to be thinking in terms of community defense, because there is so much more than just you protecting yourself. And it's really important to know that so that you don't become a liability for your community. What are some topics that gun tubers focus on too much or not enough? I think there's a cyclical nature of building guns that comes across, which shouldn't be all that surprising given channels tend to be sponsored by the places that sell guns or gun parts. So it is almost natural that they create videos on different concepts and ideas and different ways to build guns. And don't get me wrong, if you are building an AR that you are going to be using for a lot of different use cases, or that you have specific roles for, it's worth thinking through it, sure. But I think it is really easy to miss the forest for the trees when it comes to stuff like different rifle builds. Recce builds are a perfect example. I don't want to discourage people from doing things they love, and I would even go so far as to say recce builds are not useless. It's basically an AR that's set up to do a lot of different jobs. Sure, whatever. But I really want to avoid people getting into gear creep. there is a really bad tendency among new shooters to think this bit of kit would fix me. And you know what would fix you? Fucking train more. I'm fine with building guns for things you've got a use case for, or things you just want to shoot. But if you've got a solid all-around AR, I don't want to hear about you building a recce rifle that's similar to or like very mildly different. I want to see you training like a fucking demon with what you have. Be able to adjust with skill instead of with gear. Well, thank you all for those questions. I really do appreciate it. That's going to be it for this episode. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. These people right here are the reason I get to keep making this stuff. Gigantic shout out to Violet Riley, Goddess of All That She Encounters, Molly McAllister, and Marshall Nye, who are in my shout out gang. If you want to join them, you can get me to say literally anything at this point. I will shout out a political movement, shout out your name, shout out a name that you think is funny, whatever you want. It could be happening right now. But that's going to be it for me, y'all. Thank you all for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. Stay dangerous, keep each other safe, and remember, moral doesn't mean legal, and Stonewall was a fucking riot. Peace.